The night sky over southern England was deceptively calm. Stars flickered faintly above the chalk cliffs, while the cold wind rustled through rows of tents, carrying the scent of wet earth and unwashed soldiers. In the quiet, the hum of distant engines from massive landing crafts in the harbor hinted at the storm to come. For thousands of American soldiers, this night was a crucible, one that would test courage, fear, and the very will to survive. Private James Sullivan sat cross-legged on his bunk, staring at the worn wooden floor. He had left the rolling fields of Kansas 6 months ago, a boy turned soldier, now hardened by the endless drills and grim warnings of his commanders. His hands shook slightly as he polished the strap of his rifle. Every scrape of metal against wood echoed unnaturally in the tent. He could hear the low murmurs of men around him, some whispering letters home, others praying silently, their lips moving without sound. Sullivan tried to focus on his breathing, but his mind raced with images of what lay ahead: barbed wire, machine gun fire, and the dreaded cliffs of Normandy. He had read the briefings, memorized the maps, but nothing could prepare a man for the unknown. Captain Robert Hayes paced nearby, his boots thudding against the dirt floor with a disciplined cadence. A veteran of North Africa and Sicily, Hayes carried the weight of experience like a heavy cloak. His face was lined, not just with age, but with the memory of fallen comrades. He paused beside Sullivan, laying a steadying hand on the young soldier's shoulder. "It's going to be chaos," he said quietly, voice low but firm. But chaos isn't death. Chaos is opportunity for courage, for survival. Remember that. Sullivan nodded, swallowing hard, though his stomach felt like it had turned to lead. Outside the tent, Lieutenant Maria Thompson was double-checking communications gear. As a Signal Corps officer, her role was crucial. One misfired radio call could cost hundreds of lives. The glow from the lantern highlighted her determined face. She checked frequencies, adjusted antennas, and scribbled notes in her logbook. The technical preparations were meticulous, precise, but Thompson knew that no amount of preparation could fully control the chaos that awaited on the beaches of Normandy. Still, she pressed on, her hands moving with steady, practiced efficiency, while her mind replayed maps and coded messages like a relentless machine. In the command tents, generals and strategists pored over aerial photographs, marking German fortifications and strongpoints in red ink. They debated artillery strikes, naval bombardments, and the timing of the airborne divisions dropping behind enemy lines. Every movement, every calculation was weighed against the potential loss of life. Major General Leonard, eyes sharp behind his spectacles, slammed a fist on the table as a map fluttered under the wind from the open tent flap. "Timing is everything," he barked. "If we miss our window, thousands die for nothing." The men around him nodded grimly, the tension so thick it seemed to press down on the entire camp. Across the countryside, Allied deception operations were in full swing. Inflatable tanks, dummy aircraft, and fake radio transmissions were designed to mislead the Germans, convincing them that an invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. Soldiers involved in these missions moved under the cover of darkness, aware that even one mistake could unravel the delicate plan. Yet, despite these distractions, the real focus remained on the men waiting in the landing crafts, staring into the black horizon and wondering if they would ever return home. As midnight passed, Sullivan found himself outside the tent, staring at the Channel waters. The black waves reflected starlight and lanterns from distant ships, each one packed with men and vehicles destined for the shore. He imagined the German guns trained on those very waters, each cannon capable of ripping through the hulls, sending soldiers into freezing death. His breath came out in visible puffs, a mixture of cold air and mounting fear. He felt the presence of the soldiers around him, hundreds of men, all as terrified and resolute as he was. In that moment, he realized he was not alone. Courage, he understood, was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. Inside the command tent, the tension was mirrored in every decision. Generals argued over the timing of airborne drops, the accuracy of naval fire, and the availability of reinforcements. Every officer understood that the success of the operation depended on precision, yet none could predict the chaos that awaited on the beaches of Normandy. Still, she pressed on, her hands moving with steady, practiced efficiency, while her mind replayed maps and coded messages like a relentless machine. Meanwhile, the soldiers tried to cling to routine to keep panic at bay. Some shared cigarettes in quiet corners, others whispered prayers. One young man scribbled a note to his mother describing the green fields of England and his longing for home. Another, a seasoned sergeant, recited a poem he had learned as a boy, the rhythm offering a fragile anchor in the storm of anticipation. Sullivan listened to their voices, finding comfort in the mundane human connections that reminded him why he fought, not for glory, but for family, friends, and the hope that the world could be free from tyranny. As 3 a.m. approached, the camp grew quieter. Soldiers returned to their bunks, weapons ready, minds sharp. Captain Hayes gave a nod of reassurance, a silent affirmation of leadership that steadied the nerves of the men. Outside, the first signals of dawn painted the horizon in pale, uncertain light. The water, which was once black, now glimmered faintly, as if reflecting the hope and dread of the thousands about to cross it. The tension was unbearable, yet beneath it a quiet determination thrummed. They would face the storm together, and somehow they would survive, or die trying. In the final moments before embarkation, Sullivan, Hayes, and Thompson each embraced their own private thoughts. Sullivan thought of Kansas, of his little sister, and the dream of returning home. Hayes recalled comrades lost, vowing silently to honor their memory. Thompson focused on duty, the knowledge that lives depended on her skill. Across the English coast, thousands of soldiers braced themselves, feeling the weight of history pressing down. The calm before the storm was ending. In a few hours, the roar of artillery, the cries of battle, and the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy would transform ordinary men into legends. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the soldiers could only take a deep breath, tighten their grips, and step forward into the chaos that would forever change the course of the war. The first light of dawn barely touched the horizon when the roar of naval guns shattered the morning calm. Smoke and fires streaked across the water as the bombardment of German defenses began. Private James Sullivan gripped the edge of the landing craft, his knuckles white, feeling the metal shudder beneath the onslaught. The once calm channel had become a wall of surging waves, foam, and the deafening cacophony of artillery. Every man around him knew what awaited: a beach lined with German machine guns, barbed wire, and a relentless hail of bullets. "Keep your heads down," shouted Sergeant Thompson, a grizzled veteran with a jagged scar along his jaw. His voice barely carried over the chaos, but it was enough to ground the terrified soldiers. Sullivan's heart raced. Every instinct screamed to dive beneath the bench, but he knew that survival meant moving forward, into the storm. As the ramp dropped, water rushed in, icy and unrelenting, soaking his boots and chilling him to the bone. The beach exploded in violence. German shells tore into the sand with ear-splitting detonations, throwing debris and screams into the air. Men fell beside Sullivan, some crying out, some silent, their faces frozen in shock. He dove forward, dragging a wounded comrade, the weight of him nearly toppling them both into the surf. Each step was agony. The wet sand sucked at boots, waves slammed into bodies, and bullets shredded the air with deadly precision. Sullivan saw men around him falter, stumble, and fall, some forever, but he forced himself forward, driven by fear, duty, and an unshakable desire to survive. Captain Robert Hayes was already leading his unit toward a heavily fortified bunker on the high cliffs. His voice cut through the chaos as he barked orders, directing men to cover each other, to provide suppressive fire, and to stay alive long enough to reach the enemy fortifications. Explosions rocked the sand beneath them. The smell of smoke, gunpowder, and seawater mingled in Sullivan's nostrils. He could hear cries, some orders, some prayers, some screams of pain. The beach was a nightmare come to life, every second a test of endurance and courage. Amid the chaos, small acts of heroism shone through. A medic, stooped over a fallen soldier, risked his own life to drag him to safety, ignoring the bullets that tore the sand around them. Another young private, barely 18, picked up a dropped rifle and fired relentlessly at the German positions, buying precious seconds for his squad to advance. Sullivan, inspired by their bravery, pushed onward, helping a wounded comrade to crawl behind a small sand dune. Each man's survival depended not just on skill, but on the courage and sacrifice of those beside him. The cliffs loomed above, jagged and formidable. German soldiers fired from fortified bunkers, their bullets cutting through sandbags and flesh with terrifying accuracy. Hayes knew that taking the high ground was critical. He signaled to 2 men to flank the bunker while he provided covering fire. Gunfire erupted in a deafening roar. Men shouted, grenades exploded, and sand and smoke obscured everything. The smell of blood mixed with salt water, and every step forward was a gamble between life and death. Lieutenant Maria Thompson, stationed on the back of a landing craft, worked furiously to coordinate artillery and naval bombardments. Each call was vital, each error potentially fatal. "Adjust fire. Left 50 meters. Suppress that bunker," she shouted, her voice strained but precise. Her hands moved over dials and switches, her mind racing as she tracked the soldiers advancing on the beach. She had trained for this moment, but nothing in her calculations could fully capture the terror on the ground. Yet she persisted, knowing that every shell landing correctly could save dozens of lives. Time became distorted. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes felt like hours. Sullivan's vision blurred from exhaustion and adrenaline. Around him, men fell, some screaming, others eerily silent. He caught sight of Sergeant Thompson lying motionless in the sand. The sergeant's hand twitched faintly, and he knew he had to move quickly. He dragged Thompson's body behind a crumbling sandbag wall, covering him with the last of his strength. Nearby, a small squad had managed to breach a wire barrier, engaging German soldiers in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Knives clashed, rifles cracked, and men fought like animals, driven by instinct and fear. As the morning wore on, some units began to find footholds. Small dunes and broken walls provided temporary cover. Hayes's group had reached a machine gun nest atop a sand dune. With careful precision, he and his men tossed grenades, silencing the guns and allowing others to surge forward. Sullivan, panting and soaked through, saw the tide beginning to turn, inch by bloody inch. The beach was still a scene of chaos, but the American forces were slowly gaining ground. Amid the violence, moments of humanity persisted. Soldiers shared water, reassured the wounded, and whispered words of encouragement. Sullivan found himself helping a young man trapped under debris. "You'll make it," he murmured, gripping his rifle in one hand while pulling with the other. In those fleeting moments, courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Every life saved, every position taken was a small victory amid the overwhelming carnage. By late morning, the beach had been partially secured. The American flag, small and tattered, was planted atop a dune, signaling a foothold in enemy territory. But the victory was costly. Bodies littered the sand, cries of pain still echoed across the coastline, and every soldier knew the fight had only just begun. Hayes gathered his men, taking a moment to assess injuries, check ammunition, and prepare for the next push inland. Sullivan, exhausted and bloodied, looked back at the beach, now a scarred landscape of fire, sand, and bravery. And yet, amid the smoke and carnage, a sense of purpose remained. They had survived the first wave, pushed past the impossible, and taken the first steps toward liberating Europe. Sullivan, Hayes, and Thompson, in their own ways, understood that history had been made today, not in headlines or speeches, but in the courage of ordinary men facing unimaginable terror. The beach was a battlefield, a nightmare, a a crucible, but it was also the birthplace of legends. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the battered coastline. Waves continued to crash, artillery fire still shook the sand, but the Americans were moving forward, relentless and determined. In the distance, smoke from destroyed bunkers rose into the sky, marking the start of an operation that would forever change the course of the war. Private Sullivan adjusted his helmet, gripped his rifle, and stepped forward once more. Every man, every sacrifice, every act of courage would echo far beyond this day, shaping the future of nations and the hearts of all who would read of D-Day. By mid-afternoon, the once familiar coastline of Normandy had been transformed into a chaotic scar of war. Smoke hung thick over the beaches, the cries of the wounded mixed with the thunder of artillery, and the churned sand was dotted with the fallen. Private James Sullivan and Captain Robert Hayes, along with their battered unit, had survived the initial assault, but the fight was far from over. Inland lay the hedgerows, dense, treacherous, and crawling with enemy forces determined to stop the American advance at any cost. The hedgerows were a nightmare for the advancing soldiers. Thick hedges lined dirt roads, their roots entwined with hidden trenches and machine gun nests. Every step forward was a potential trap. Sullivan moved cautiously, rifle at the ready, scanning for the glint of German helmets or the flash of a sniper's rifle. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. Bullets ricocheted off hidden stones, and the occasional explosion threw clumps of soil into the air like grotesque fireworks. Captain Hayes led the squad along a narrow dirt lane, signaling for silence and precision. One misstep, one false move, he whispered, and we're done for. His eyes darted constantly, analyzing every hedge, every shadow. Hayes knew that unlike the beaches, where sheer numbers could push forward, inland combat required strategy, patience, and an almost unnatural awareness of one's surroundings. Sullivan felt his muscles tense, every nerve screaming with anticipation and fear. A sudden crack rang out from the right. A sniper had taken aim at Sullivan's unit. Men dove for cover, dirt flying into the air. Sullivan felt a hot sting as a bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing through his uniform and leaving him shaking. Pain was immediate, but retreat was impossible. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, dragging a fellow soldier who had been hit in the leg behind the safety of a broken wall. Each step was a gamble, every hedge hiding enemies, mines, and the unknown. Amid the chaos, moments of heroism emerged. Sergeant Thompson, still alive despite earlier injuries, threw himself across a wounded soldier to shield him from shrapnel. Nearby, another young private crawled forward under fire, tossing grenades into a machine gun nest, silencing it and saving countless lives. Sullivan watched in awe and horror, realizing that courage was often born not from absence of fear, but from its overwhelming presence. Every act of bravery was paid for in sweat, blood, and the ever-present risk of death. Lieutenant Maria Thompson, coordinating from a command post behind the lines, struggled to maintain communication. Radios crackled with static, voices shouting coordinates, requests for support, and casualty reports. "We need reinforcements at Sector Delta," she barked into her headset. "Move the artillery left, cover that hedgerow." Every decision carried life or death consequences, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon her. The success of the soldiers in the hedgerows depended on her precision, and she knew it. As the American forces pushed deeper, they encountered German armored vehicles hidden among the dense foliage. Tanks emerged suddenly, spewing fire and tearing through barricades. Hayes ordered men to take cover and coordinate with artillery units. Sullivan, adrenaline pumping, hurled a grenade at the lead tank, watching in horror and relief as it exploded with a deafening roar. The ground shook beneath their feet, trees splintered, and smoke choked their lungs. It was a grim reminder that survival demanded not only courage, but split-second decisions and unflinching resolve. The villages of Normandy loomed ahead, bombed out and eerily silent. Civilians peered from broken windows, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. The soldiers moved cautiously, aware that every building could conceal a hidden enemy, a trap, or worse. Hayes led his squad into a crumbling bakery, securing the structure and using it as a staging point. Sullivan helped load ammunition and tend to the wounded, his hands slick with blood and grime. They had come so far, yet the road to liberation was still lined with danger and death. French resistance fighters began to appear, emerging from the countryside to guide American troops and sabotage German supply lines. They whispered information about hidden traps, mined roads, and enemy positions. Sullivan was struck by their bravery, ordinary civilians risking everything for the liberation of their homeland. One resistance fighter, a young woman named Elise, handed him a bottle of water and a small map, pointing toward a German command post hidden in the woods. "We can't stop now," she said, eyes fierce with determination. "Every second counts." The intensity of the fighting grew as night approached. Darkness offered cover, but also uncertainty. Sniper fire, sudden ambushes, and the ever-present threat of mines kept every soldier on edge. Sullivan and Hayes navigated the treacherous terrain, clearing buildings, checking every doorway, and moving methodically forward. The sounds of battle never ceased: bullets, explosions, cries, and the rumble of tanks. Time became fluid, measured not in minutes but in survival of the next breath. Amid the carnage, soldiers found moments of humanity. Sullivan helped a terrified boy hide in a cellar, sharing his meager rations and whispering promises of safety. Hayes paused to reassure a young private shaking with fear, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. Even in the hell of combat, bonds were forged, courage inspired, and hope, however fragile, persisted. These moments were fleeting but vital, reminders that they were fighting not just to survive, but to liberate, to protect, and to endure. By the end of the day, American forces had carved a tenuous path through the hedgerows, seizing key villages and cutting German supply lines. The cost was enormous: soldiers wounded, equipment destroyed, and lives lost. But the foothold was established, and the tide of the battle was slowly turning. Sullivan, bloodied and exhausted, stood on a small hill, surveying the battered landscape. Smoke rose from the village below, and the groans of the wounded echoed through the night air. Yet amidst the devastation, a glimmer of victory shone. They had pushed forward, survived the inferno, and proven that courage and determination could bend the course of history. As darkness fell on Normandy, Hayes gathered his unit for a brief respite. Fires were lit, medical aid administered, and plans made for the next day. Sullivan sat on a broken wall, writing a few words in his journal. "We survived. Somehow we survived. Tomorrow will be harder, but we will not stop. Freedom depends on us." Around him, men shared quiet prayers, whispered letters home, and prepared themselves for the battles yet to come. The inland inferno had tested them in ways they could never have imagined, but they had endured. And as the night cloaked Normandy in shadows, Sullivan, Hayes, and Thompson, each in their own way, understood that the war was far from over. The battle for Europe had only just begun, and the courage, sacrifice, and determination displayed that day would echo far beyond the fields, villages, and hedgerows of Normandy. By the early hours of June 7, 1944, the battered coastline of Normandy had begun to settle into an uneasy calm. The initial chaos of the landing had faded, replaced by the grim reality of war: shattered sand, shattered men, and the lingering echo of artillery fire. Private James Sullivan crouched behind a ruined wall, his uniform soaked with sweat, mud, and the blood of fallen comrades. Around him, the wounded we tended to, makeshift triage stations hastily set up among the craters and debris. The stench of smoke and gunpowder hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the carnage they had endured. Captain Robert Hayes moved among his men, checking for injuries and ensuring the unit remained cohesive. His face was smudged with dirt and grime, but his eyes were sharp, reflecting the weight of command and the burden of lives he was responsible for. Every man had been tested beyond measure, and Hayes knew that the cost of victory would haunt them forever. He paused to kneel beside Sullivan, offering a word of encouragement. "We made it this far," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we push further, but never forget what you've done today. You've already made history." The Americans had secured a tenuous foothold in Normandy, but the battle was far from over. German forces, though battered and disoriented, were regrouping, preparing to counterattack with the remaining armored divisions and entrenched troops further inland. Lieutenant Maria Thompson worked tirelessly, coordinating artillery strikes and radio communications to maintain the fragile momentum. Her hands trembled from exhaustion, yet she persisted, knowing that the lives of hundreds depended on her precision. Every call, every adjustment, every calculated risk mattered. As dawn broke over the coastline, the full scale of the day's sacrifices became painfully clear. Sullivan walked among the bodies of fallen comrades, pausing at each to whisper a silent prayer. Faces he had known only hours ago were now forever frozen in time, victims of the relentless violence of war. The young soldier felt a mix of sorrow, guilt, and resolve. Each life lost was a stark reminder of the price of freedom, but also a testament to courage and duty. These men, ordinary Americans thrust into extraordinary circumstances, had stood firm against a formidable enemy. The villages of Normandy, bombed and scarred, now served as staging grounds for the next phase of the invasion. Civilians emerged cautiously, their eyes wide with fear and hope. Soldiers helped distribute food and water, offering words of reassurance. Sullivan encountered a small group of children, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. He handed them chocolate and rations, smiling despite the pain gnawing at his heart. In these moments, amid the devastation, humanity persisted. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep them moving forward. Captain Hayes gathered his officers to plan the next push. Maps were spread across a makeshift table, markers indicating enemy positions, supply routes, and strategic objectives. The discussion was intense, each decision carrying the weight of countless lives. Hayes's voice was calm but firm, cutting through the exhaustion and chaos. "We hold what we've gained, regroup, and press forward at first light. Every man counts, every life matters. We are the spearhead of liberation, and we cannot falter now." The officers nodded, the gravity of their mission settling like a stone in their stomachs. Throughout the day, small victories accumulated. Bridges were secured, supply lines established, and key roads cleared of enemy forces. The cooperation between American troops and French resistance fighters proved invaluable. Elise, the young resistance fighter who had guided Sullivan's unit inland, coordinated sabotage missions against German reinforcements. Explosions echoed from hidden positions, disrupting enemy communications and slowing counterattacks. These coordinated efforts demonstrated that D-Day was not just an American endeavor, but a collaborative effort that would define the liberation of Europe. Yet the cost was undeniable. Medical tents overflowed with the wounded, artillery crews exhausted from continuous bombardment, and soldiers physically and mentally broken by relentless combat. Sullivan, though alive, bore the scars of battle, a grazed shoulder, cuts along his arms, and a mind haunted by the screams of those who had fallen. Captain Hayes moved silently among the men, offering encouragement where he could, but knowing that no words could fully soothe the trauma etched into their souls. Lieutenant Thompson, too, recognized the invisible wounds, the fear, the loss, the relentless anxiety that would follow every soldier long after the guns fell silent. As evening fell over Normandy, Sullivan sat atop a small hill overlooking the battered coastline. Fires flickered among the ruins, casting long shadows across the sand and hedgerows. He reflected on the events of the past 24 hours, the fear, the courage, the moments of humanity amidst horror. Letters clutched in his pocket reminded him of home, of family waiting for his safe return, and the life he hoped to reclaim once the war was won. But he also knew that the men beside him, friends, comrades, brothers, had paid a price that could never be undone. Captain Hayes joined him, standing silently for a moment as he gazed at the coastline. "History will remember today," he said softly, "but it will remember the names, the faces, the sacrifice, not the statistics. Every man who stood here, every life lost or saved, is part of that story." Sullivan nodded, understanding the weight of Hayes's words. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. D-Day was the beginning of a new chapter, a turning point that would shape the fate of nations and define the courage of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Lieutenant Thompson, coordinating one last series of communications before nightfall, sent word that the Americans had secured their objectives for the day and that reinforcements would arrive to strengthen their positions. She allowed herself a brief moment of reflection, imagining the soldiers on the beaches and in the hedgerows. Each life, each decision, each act of bravery had brought them closer to victory. She closed her eyes briefly, whispering a silent prayer for the safety of the men she could not physically protect, but whose lives depended on her skill and resolve. Night fully descended over Normandy, a heavy cloak over the battlefield. Fires from destroyed bunkers cast flickering light across the landscape, illuminating the devastation and heroism alike. Sullivan, Hayes, and Thompson, each marked by the trials of the day, prepared for the next phase of the campaign. They knew that the road ahead would be long, arduous, and filled with uncertainty. Yet the foothold they had gained, the lives they had saved, and the courage they had shown had already begun to turn the tide of history. In those quiet, reflective moments, the soldiers understood the meaning of their struggle. D-Day was more than a military operation. It was a testament to human courage, sacrifice, and resilience. The Americans had stormed Normandy, faced unimaginable terror, and prevailed, but the victory was without cost. The dead and wounded were a constant reminder that freedom demanded sacrifice. Yet in the midst of loss, hope endured. For every life lost, a dozen more pressed forward, determined to carry the mission through, to liberate Europe, and to honor those who had fallen. As the stars emerged over Normandy, Sullivan wrote in his journal, "We have survived, but the cost is heavy. Today we made history. Tomorrow we fight again. We fight for freedom, for each other, and for those who cannot." Captain Hayes stood beside him, silent but resolute, while Lieutenant Thompson monitored the radio channels, ensuring that the momentum of D-Day would continue. The battle had been brutal, the losses devastating, but the spirit of courage, sacrifice, and determination burned brightly. D-Day had begun the liberation of Europe. It had tested the limits of ordinary men, forged heroes in the crucible of battle, and changed the course of history forever. The beaches, hedgerows, and villages of Normandy bore witness to the bravery and suffering of thousands of soldiers who stormed into the unknown, their courage echoing across time. And as dawn would rise again, so too would rise the relentless drive of the Allied forces, carrying with them the promise of freedom, justice, and the enduring legacy of those who had stormed Normandy's shores.